a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and I am joined on the set by Dr. Larry Garrity and Dr. Kent Bramlett, both of La Sierra University, both with histories and professional ties to archaeology and Bible, and Larry is a former president of La Sierra University, administrative experience as well. I think with this series on archaeology and the Bible, book by book, we are part of the furniture now. I think the three of us have done these. And it's been truly a joy for me to join you two as we think about how archaeology can inform our reading of Scripture.
I think we've all worked together for about 20 years, haven't we, in the Middle East, as well as more recently at La Sierra.
That's true. And Larry and I could say we go back.
I was going to say, I think the 20 years is in deference
to include you.
Right.
We want to be inclusive. The book that we turn our attention to now is Deuteronomy. We have walked our way through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and now we turn to Deuteronomy, which is translated from the Greek to mean what?
A second law, or the second giving of the laws.
Yes, the second
idea.
Second law, which is interesting. I mean, when people read through these books that we call the Pentateuch, these 5 books, there is a lot of repetition, and maybe second giving of the law, or at least second law, means something that we just hadn't thought about before. Maybe there is a purpose just in the nature of the book of Deuteronomy to repeat a lot of what has happened before. Because you really do have a number, I mean, the tribal entities, some of the laws are repeated. There are these sets of 10, I mean, the 10 Commandments are even repeated. So maybe there's something here that we ought to pay attention to, just in the name of the book itself.
It's a nice summary, I think, of the other books that have preceded it. So it casts it in a new and different way, a lot of the same information, but in a different way.
It's framed very differently.
Framed differently, that's right.
It is. It comes at that whole section, that whole period of history, in a different way with a different purpose. And maybe we ought to pay attention to the fact that that could contribute to these repetitions and these differences. So Deuteronomy, what does that book do for you? I mean, is that something that, I mean, do you get up in the morning to read the book of Deuteronomy? Is that something that excites you, or is that something that waits for later in the day?
Well, early Christians must have. It's the third most quoted book in the New Testament. Psalms, then Isaiah, then Deuteronomy. So that's a surprise to many people. But I think as we get into it, we might see why that is the case. It is exciting to me. It really is the foundational document, I think, for the biblical telling of the history of Israel. So Joshua, really Judges, Samuel, and Kings formulate their telling of Israel's history through the theology of Deuteronomy.
And we need to explore that. We'll do that in a minute. I want to hear Larry's kind of initial feedback to Deuteronomy. I appreciate, Kent, your comments about the New Testament, and I want to hear from you about Qumran, too, and the Dead Sea Scroll community. Larry, something about...
Yeah, when we're reading the Pentateuch, there are a lot of stories, there's a lot of legal material, there are various kinds of lists and so on, but when we get to Deuteronomy, it, as you said, is framed differently as sermons or as homilies. And so it reads well, and is a good thing to read in the morning when you get out of bed, because it fits together nicely, and there are lessons that Moses wants Israel to hear and to know about. And so it is a theologically important book.
Would you say that it's warmer to read
I think so,
than
yeah.
the other law books? I mean, a sermon, by its very nature, is going to be appealing.
Homiletic in style.
And it'll be homiletical, it will be hortatory, it will give exhortation, and it's typically or often given in a way that attempts to win. I mean, you do have some fairly strong statements about what happens when you don't obey, but still, this context, this sort of winning, or at least hopefully winning context of a sermon does flavor it quite a bit differently, doesn't it?
What it's trying to do is more obvious maybe than what some of the other materials that we've had.
Right, right. Well, we will come back to that. Now, theologically, you mentioned it is maybe the most theological.
I think it is. I would make the argument.
How would you frame that? What makes it that way?
Well, I think the thesis or the central argument of Deuteronomy is that obedience or observance of the law determines Israel's future. And it's laid out as the blessings and curses, but if they follow the law, then God blesses them. And if they don't, they are recipients then of these curses and disasters. Right. So it's put forward, as you said, it's trying to be convincing. You do this, and it even gives hope. If you don't, you can always turn back. Right. But that then is played out through the telling of the history of Israel.
And that telling happens primarily through a set of books that scholars call the Deuteronomic, based on Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomic history, or as we abbreviate it, DTR. So DTR consists of what books?
Well, Joshua, Judges, for us, 1st and 2nd Samuel. In the Hebrew, it's one book, and Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings.
And they're framed around this theme that I learned as the act-consequence relation. So obedience has its consequences, disobedience. And this isn't a kind of a cold, calculated kind of process. This is within the warmth of a preacher who wants to win, and of a God who, in Deuteronomy, takes on kind of the father figure. That's the first time we have that. And
it's all a part of, in a context of the covenant, or the familial, I should say, efforts that God has to include us, and we're all part of this family, and we all have roles to play within this covenant context.
And the kings are judged according to this,
That's right.
whether they're good or bad, and there are things which maybe delay the consequences. The covenant with David, the reluctance to give up Israel, again within this family type narrative.
Well, I think that captures the book. I mean, we're going to look at it in more detail. But we also have some things, some objects in front of us. Kent, what do we have on this table?
Well, these mostly date to what we like to call the late Bronze Age, which is, broadly speaking, again, the time of the Exodus, the time of well, really, we could go back to Egypt, but here we're thinking about entry into the land.
So the
14th century, 13th century, so the 1200s, 1300s BC. And especially distinctive for that time period are these certain kinds of imported pottery vessels, which we know very well they come from Cyprus. For instance, this, which is a type of base ring, if you tap it, it has a hard metallic sound because of the high firing temperature. But again, it was a little medicine bottle. Well, maybe sometimes oversubscribed to, but it was opium or a tincture of opium, like laudanum perhaps. And again, these vessels held unguents, ointments, perfumes, a little dipper juglet, typical painting. If you look at this one carefully, you can see bands, stripes, and crossbars of red paint. This is very typical.
And we have that on this vessel too.
We do. And then moving to larger vessels, of course, storage vessels, vessels for probably products of the land, oil and wine and so forth. And this is another Cypriot vessel, only I think this is probably a local imitation of the imported ware. If you couldn't afford the real thing, you bought the knockoff version. This looks like that to me. There's very little evidence of painting on it, but it has this wishbone handle, which is part of the design of this vessel. You don't have one unless you have that handle on it.
Talk about the handles, the other handles, because each one is different, and yet they're typical of the period.
Well, this one has a double rope type handle, which actually comes down from the earlier Middle Bronze Age period, time of Abraham. Well, again, each of them, here we have the little loop handles on the side. You could perhaps hang the vessel secured in a stand.
And there are little holes where you could put a string or something if you wanted to.
You could,
hold it.
right. And each handle has a place where it's supposed to attach. For instance, this one always attaches around a little ring on the neck, never up at the rim.
Like this one does here.
Right, right. Larry, we're going to be talking a lot about laws and law codes, Deuteronomy, the second law. There is our miniature version. We've seen it before on this program, but it seemed to fit with this one. What is this?
It does, because the giving of the law, we're reminded by this little replica that not only Israel had laws, and Israel's God, who promulgated his law, did something similar to what other gods did with other nations. And so this goes back to the time of Hammurabi, and it's interesting to, who of course was a Babylonian king, and it's interesting to compare his laws that were given to him by Shamash, the Babylonian god, with the laws that Moses has preserved for us that were given by Yahweh, the Israelite God. And not all of them were given by the gods, but many of these laws are typical across boundaries. They're part of the culture of the times. And so it's not surprising that as human beings, you find similar laws in all cultures of the time.
And with divine origins?
And with divine origins.
Which probably adds a note of authority.
It does.
It's not just that the king or some official says you ought to do this, but God says you ought to do this.
And when we talk about what God says, we sometimes call that apodictic law. God says this is the law, and he just lays down the rules, such as the Ten Commandments. But there are other kinds that are called case laws. And so if you do such and such, then that following are the consequences. And so we have both kinds of law, apodictic law and case laws.
Right. And when we turn our attention, actually in the next episode of this program, to the section in Deuteronomy, the largest section, we will do that comparison with several law codes. And just think about how these various principles and these various goals and these various objectives for life that made sense, how they found their way into these various law codes. And so I think that's an interesting thing. This is part of their world. This is a part of the biblical audience's world. And they would have resonated quickly with that.
And what's so exciting about the kind of work we do in the Middle East and archaeology is that we're uncovering the context for many of these things that we read about in Scripture that we would otherwise think are maybe peculiar to Israel, or we don't know very much about the background. But as archaeology works more and more, we're finding all these parallels. We find out how people lived and what they thought and their relationship to their gods and so on. And so we can see the difference between Israel and its God and what he requires and how he relates to them compared to other...
and similarities.
And similarities,
so what
absolutely.
seems to be what the air everybody breathed, and then the air that Israel breathed. And part of Israel's thinking about law, Torah, is not the negative connotation of the three-letter word, L-A-W, law. Probably better should be translated as guideline or instruction or pointing of the way. And it's a pointing of the way to a structured life in the midst of chaos. So the Old Testament believers always celebrated Torah. The Psalms celebrate the Torah. You know, it's a gift. It's better than gold. It's better than the finest gold you can find because it's divine, it's in its origin, and it's a way of ordering your life in a responsible, meaningful, and rewarding way. So that's positive. We don't normally think of law that way. It was very redemptive. And then we have a few other artifacts, some that are metal, a couple of swords, daggers, and then a metal battle axe of some kind, and then a couple of stones. The stones, always interesting to talk about these spherical stones. Probably at least some were used in some kind of military context as sling stones. If one finds on them a nice shiny surface, it's been used in the kitchen. So these are multi-purpose tools that who knows what their original purpose was. But
You know, they were. I support the original argument of military weapon. I mean, the Assyrian panels show the Assyrian slingers with these perfect spheres.
Okay, so
in the
what we're going to
slings.
do then is get together and look at how far back we can
We can push
determine.
that, yeah.
That's right, and how far back we can push some kind of domestic use.
Yeah.
'Cause- And I don't know what the answer to that's going to be. I think it'll be interesting to chase down. But in any case, we have people who were entrepreneurs who made good use of them, and whichever way, they are part of the life of people in the time of Deuteronomy. We want to turn our attention to some slides and think about this book of Deuteronomy and archaeological contributions to it. And I think one of the places to start is an outline. One of us, maybe more of us, mentioned that this is a sermon or sermons. So what do we have here in these?
So the three sermons are there, and each of them has a kind of theme that you've included for us. So the first 4 books talk about Israel's journey. And the heart of Deuteronomy deals with the law, the second giving of the law, as it were, chapters 5 to 28. And then right at the end, Moses sort of summarizes all that in this covenant context, and that is the thing that ties it all together.
Right, right. And then we have these appendices, some of which could not, one of which at least could not have been written by Moses,
No.
which raises the question about the role of various peoples and communities in the process of these biblical books getting to us. So we have some editing going on. These little statements, until this day, suggest some kind of distance away where people needed to be, some explanation was needed to help people understand. And so we ought to think of biblical books, probably all of them, as having origins, I mean, we would say with a divine authority, and that's what inspiration is, but also with people, and then people who loved the theology, developed it, as in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, but also in Deuteronomy. So we probably have some framing and some updating, probably, for an audience from much later times. The history was probably finalized, what, at the time of the Babylonian captivity, something like that?
Well, it's interesting, yes. In Kings, it appears that we have telling of the history, you know, because that's concurrent up during the time of the kings. So it says, until this time, such and such. You can see it until this day, it's still there. But then we have this, during the exile probably, someone has continued the history down to that point, so we can see where that addition occurs.
And then it actually ends, hopefully, with the king in, the Judean king in captivity, but maybe, the one we're putting some hopes on, maybe coming out. And so
Harkening
there's a
back
sense-
to the hope from Deuteronomy,
Exactly.
if you repent.
Exactly, exactly. This is all tied together in ways
is.
that when you just sit down and read the Bible through, one might not recognize. But with this touch of scholarship behind it, it's an interesting thing to put together and adds, I think, to the richness.
And after these 3 sermons, as you mentioned, these appendices, and number 2 and 3, the Song of Moses and the final blessing, are in poetic form. And many scholars feel that the oldest parts of the Pentateuch are the ones that are the poetry, and that those may be the original, just the way they sang them back then. They've been preserved for a long time and not updated, because it's harder to update poetry.
Poetry is very challenging.
That's right.
isn't it?
So it's especially interesting to think of those 2 chapters as perhaps being among the oldest chapters. Yeah.
We'll be thinking about that more as we move through. I think people would argue that Judges 5, the poetry
Yes.
of Judges 5 might be
Maybe
a
the very earliest. All right.
So
You know,
we've got things to think about.
It's been very important in, well, the Middle Ages, in Jewish tradition, to know the author of every book. So, of course, the entire entire Pentateuch was authored by Moses. And when Spinoza first pointed out that he didn't think Moses wrote about his death, now it had been said that he spoke in vision of the future, but Spinoza wasn't convinced. This was heretical.
It was.
And that was one of the reasons for his excommunication from the Jewish community.
So we have to think about that. And as we've processed a number of hard questions on this program, and we'll continue to, because there are challenges. And what I like to think about is the good news, which typically affirms us in ways we've always thought, and the potentially good news, not the bad news, the potentially good news, because maybe some of these challenges will force us to step back, think about them in new ways, and actually put them in context, in ways that are truly redemptive and holistic for the biblical pictures. So we will have occasion to revisit that and test that hypothesis.
Right.
Okay. The other form, and there are 2 slides on this, it's only half of them. What is this treaty form?
Well, again, the exciting thing about what archaeology has contributed to our better understanding of the book of Deuteronomy, the Bible talks about Hittites, and a couple centuries ago, people didn't have the kind of data from archaeology that we have now. They didn't know anything about the Hittites, so the only thing that they knew about the Hittites is what the Bible said. And some people sort of doubted that any people like that ever lived. But now we've excavated their capital, Hattusha, in Turkey, that's in the bend of the Halys River, and all of the surrounding countryside belong to the Hittites, and we know their history, and we know their religion, and we know their laws, and many Hittites, of course, came down further south, and so interacted with the territory that the Bible is especially interested in. And we find that the Hittite sovereign would, or king, would make a treaty with people that they conquered or that they were related to. And these were called suzerainty treaties because the Hittite king was the person who had the power, was the suzerain. And he would say that based on our previous relationship and what we've accomplished for you, these are ways that it would be appropriate for you to relate to me and to kingship. And so this happened roughly, let's say, the time of Moses and the Israelites and so on. And so many scholars feel that by studying the Hittite suzerainty treaties gives us a window on the treaty that God was making with his people that we see in Exodus, for instance, and is repeated in Deuteronomy. And so you have outlined the sections of these treaties that we often find.
So if this is true, then the biblical writers are using what would be common knowledge as structures or metaphors, and in the process here, using a political treaty. We have a physical, powerful king and a lot of vassals, and now putting God in the place and following this through, but now it's a relationship with God. So, and we ought to give the biblical writers freedom to do that, because actually they do a lot. And it's archaeology that uncovers some of these connections.
And so when people have pulled out the 10 Commandments and made them sound like, God is requiring these of us and so on, it sounds like this is things that are very hard to do and is a very mean God who's powerful and who insists on us acting this way. Actually, when you see how the commandments fit in to the suzerainty treaties, it's those stipulations or those laws are the ways that God says, I've already saved you. When you cross the Red Sea, I saved you. And now, these are ways that if you relate to me in the following ways, the following commandments, we'll have a successful relationship. And so it becomes much better news. It's not that you follow the stipulations in order to be saved, but you follow the stipulations because you have been saved and are now able to do that. Yeah.
And then the other parts of this, and this is only half, so we have this prologue with the deeds that you just talked about, stipulations we typically think about for the Ten Commandments. In fact, some people would argue that at least in Exodus 20, this pretty much follows.
It does,
or
yeah.
Exodus 20 pretty much follows this. Others would say that the book of Deuteronomy as a whole
Is part
tends
of
to
that.
follow this. So that you then end up with provision of a public reading. I don't know that that's as prominent, although it does happen. And then in the second half, the witness, and then blessings and curses. In Deuteronomy, chapters 27 and 28 are those,
Yeah.
the curses
Yeah.
and the blessings.
And when we get to the repetition of the covenant in Shechem, we'll see how the reading also took place there.
Right. So we've got these components, and it would have made sense to ancient Israelites to do that. Now, we're talking about the journey. We will not have time to get through the whole journey. A standard map, we've talked about this map before and the challenges of identifying sites, but the standard map following the red here from the Nile Delta, coming down along the coast to at least the traditional Mount Sinai. Others put Sinai in all kinds of other places. And then coming up to Ezion Geber or Elath, I think is one of the ways it's described. And then some heading up to Kadesh Barnea, sending out the spies and so on. And then some more wandering, so on. Punan is something that we need to get Dr. Tom Levy on our program to talk about, excavating at Feinan. And if they are the same, it's going to be interesting to think about. And then, of course, going around. And it's this journey that Deuteronomy 1 through 4 summarizes. And it also this. Talk for a minute about this. We don't have a lot of time, but talk to us for a minute about what this map is about.
Well, it sort of shows what happens when the Israelites came up on the eastern side of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, and they were ready to cross over. 2.5 tribes, the ones that are pictured there, Reuben, Gad, and a half tribe of Manasseh.
And these vary a bit because it is hard to identify all of the sites.
Right. But according to the biblical story, those tribes said, look, we like it pretty well over here. We're glad to cross the river and help you, settle the other side of the river, but we'd sort of like to stay here with our families.
Right.
And so the story is that they crossed, and then the other areas were parceled out.
And we'll come back to that.
And we'll come back to that.
Especially with Joshua.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope the program has been helpful. And we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient. Keep believing and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.